Hello and welcome to Nodes and Wires, where I'm talking to various guests who regularly respond to today's aspects of music technology in an attempt to map the current electronic music network. And today I'm going to chat with Roger Linn, musician, composer, Grammy-awarded instrument designer, endorsed by the likes of Prince, The Human League, Peter Gabriel, and an army of hip-hop producers, and last but not least, the world's first LinnStrumentalist. Hello, Roger. How are you?
Wow, that's quite an introduction. Thank you. I am well.
First of all, I'd like to congratulate you because on January the 28th, the MIDI Manufacturers Association, MMA, officially announced its adoption of the MIDI polyphonic expression enhancement to the MIDI specification to ensure standardized MPE-based interoperability for the future. So, and I'm not congratulating you because you've developed all the code behind that yourself, but because this was and is a project that has been dear to you for years, not least because you have happened to develop a device, which we currently see in the picture, that's built around MPE capabilities, namely the LinnStrument in its two versions. But before we talk about the present and the future, I'd like to take a trip down memory lane with you.
Sure.
And let me first ask you the following. As someone who started off as a guitarist and songwriter, and who somehow returned to the paradigm of notes and melodies, as you put it, be it through playing the mandolin or the LinnStrument, is it weird for you to be mainly associated with electronic music at all?
Not really so much. The funny thing is, I never really thought of the instruments I made as electronic music. I was just trying to make music. For example, the first drum machines I made merely because as a songwriter, I could play all the rest of the parts. I was a guitarist, so I could play bass, and I could play guitar, and I could play enough keyboards to not get in trouble. But the hardest part for me were the drums. So it was the one thing I couldn't play very well. And so it made sense to make that. But my goal was to make better songwriting demos or more appealing productions in my little home studio.
I was mainly asking because if one searches for your name on Discogs, one can find roughly 100 entries for songwriting, performance, engineering, and programming, among names like Leon Russell, Eric Clapton, Elton John, Stanley Clarke, Alphaville, Don Henley, Toto, Mary Chapin Carpenter, Boyz II Men, and Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers even, most of which are not particularly connected to electronic music. So there is that whole standard on standard classic songwriting culture.
Well, yeah. When you think about it, all technology is just the latest in a long series of enhancements to musical instrument. Frets were a technology, brass was a technology, strings were a technology, and electronics just the latest technology. But it doesn't really, although it does have an effect on the music. Ultimately, the things that make music appealing are not changing over time so much. There are styles and all that, but you still have the same melodic concepts or rhythmic concepts. And so I don't really think of it in terms of electronic music as just music, and it's just the latest technology.
How did it all start? I mean, when did you become involved with music or in music? What triggered your interest in music technology and designing instruments?
Well, first of all, as a young man, my father was a music professor. He taught music theory and composition at the University of Southern California. My mother sang light opera and played piano. And so there were influences there, but also this was the 60s. I was born in 1955, and in the 60s, music was a way that people communicated with each other. They would tell them their friends about new songs, and that's how we learned about a lot of things in the world. That was how we learned about cultural movements, because there was no internet. There weren't many different ways that young people could learn about things. And so music, the lyrics of songs were one way that people learned about the world. And it was a revolution. There were new sounds in music with electronics and such. So this was a big influence on me. And this really made me gravitate towards music. But at the same time, there was the advancement in sciences and new technologies in the 60s. Electronics was very popular, and particularly among young people like me at the time. And so I developed these two different interests, music and technology. And so they naturally just merged together. When I was a teenager, I started learning more about electronics, and in developing the electronic circuits and then later computers and software, I chose to apply that technology toward the advancement of music. And as opposed to, at that time, people were applying technology of electronics and computers towards a variety of things. Everyone was putting little computers in everything in our lives, in cars, in microwave ovens, and musical instruments. And that was all happening in a big way. The major explosion was right around 1975. In fact, there's a book called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and he talks about people born in 1955, as I was, including among those people Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Bill Joy, Eric Schmidt, and there's a long list of people. And he said the advantage people born in this year had, 1955, was that when the microcomputer revolution hit in 1975, they were 20 years old. And 20 years old was just old enough so that you were no longer in high school, yet you weren't yet married and started to have children, so you needed to play it safe. So it was the perfect time to take a risk. And so, Jobs and Gates put computers in a home appliance, the personal computer. I decided to put them in musical instruments.
You mentioned the 60s, California. I mean, how much were you exposed to what is commonly culturally associated and locally associated with all the acts from the 60s? I mean, thinking of the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, all that.
Well, very much influenced by the music of the time. Music was a significant part of my life and of the lives of the people I knew at the time. So I wanted to make my contribution. I thought that my contribution would be, it's a great musician. And I learned later that I had more to give as a maker of musical instruments than as a player of music. My hands, when I play the guitar, tend to go in the same places they went in the mid-1970s. Whereas my brain in technology seems to move a little bit farther ahead, or I tried at least to move a little bit farther ahead of where things are right now. So, I have... there are musicians that can play instruments better than I can, and there are those who can write better songs than I can.
Although Dave Smith recently told me that you are a very avid player, a very virtuous player.
Well, it's very kind of him to say. I think he's being very generous on that. I think there's certain things I'm good at musically, but when I was a young man and I was a studio guitarist in Los Angeles, or touring guitarist, I had trouble getting the big gigs where there were friends of mine. For example, you mentioned earlier the people in the band Toto. They were all the top studio musicians in Los Angeles, and they would get all the big gigs, and I would get the ones that they would throw away. So, it's I learned that after a while, after losing enough auditions, I learned that maybe there's some things I don't know.
So you basically started with these people being your competition.
Oh, you mean like the Toto musicians, for example?
Yes.
I think I may have seen it that way. I don't think they saw it that way. They were very kind. And, they didn't want to tell me the truth, which I think I was unwilling to hear at the time, is, Roger, you're good at the technology stuff, but as a guitar player or a songwriter, you're okay. But there are better people. But I think they were too kind to tell me that to my face, right?
But how did you transition from being a musician and composer yourself to being a music technologist? I mean, I think Leon Russell is important for that.
Yes.
Can you tell a little bit about that?
Yeah, when I played with Leon Russell, I was actually not a good enough guitarist as the guitarist he normally worked with, and he knew everybody. He used to be a producer in L.A., and he had done things like the movie called The Concert for Bangladesh with George Harrison and Bob Dylan and all the best musicians of the day. But with Leon, fortunately for me, he was extremely cheap, and he didn't want to pay very much money. And I had been playing guitar in the band of his new wife, Mary McCrary. And so I happened to be around, and I was a package deal. I could play guitar on the road, but when we were in town, I could be his recording engineer, and I knew about all these new synthesizers and the new technology. So as a package deal for someone who worked cheap, I was a cost-effective choice.
How did you get exposed to synthesizers?
Well, of course, it was a very exciting new technology of the day. And I saw my first synthesizer, and I must have been, I'm thinking, 10 years old. My father brought me down to the university, and they had an early Moog Model 3P, which is one of the early single cabinet Moog synthesizers. And the fellow who was in charge of it showed it to me. And at the time, I didn't understand any of the concepts. But it really piqued my interest. And so after that time, I remember I was a little bit older, and I was in high school, and the Mini Moog came out, which was more of a mass market synthesizer. And I had a band at that time, and I must have been about 14 or 15, something like that. And there was a kid who had a Mini Moog, and his father was fairly wealthy. He was a psychiatrist. And for the kid's birthday, the father had bought him a Mini Moog. Well, of course, I invited this guy to join our band. He was a horrible musician. Who cared? He had a Mini Moog. And one of the rules of the band is we rehearsed at my house, and everyone had to leave their equipment there. So I learned, in large part, about synthesis by learning the Mini Moog and learning to be very adept at changing the settings very quickly, because of course there were no presets.
Right.
So I could go from an organ sound to a trumpet sound to a violin-like sound to a guitar-like sound, and just by twiddling the knobs.
And have you been exposed to other synth or electronic music instruments in the area? I mean, thinking of everything Don Buchla did.
Well, I didn't know so much about Don's stuff. Don was actually a good friend until he, of course, passed away about a year ago. Don was interested not only in changing musical instruments, but in changing music too. And at the time, as I mentioned earlier, I was just interested in a better way to play music that I valued. So I would gravitate initially towards synthesis to try to emulate the traditional instrument sounds, or at least use those as a departure point for new types of sounds, because I thought there was so much value in the music that had come before that I wanted to just take baby steps away from that. And that was more of Bob Moog's philosophy, or what they call sometimes the East Coast synthesis school. Don Buchla wanted to change everything. He didn't even want notes. He didn't want the even tempered scale. He wanted to do anything you want. More what is called new music, even though it's been new ever since about 1960. That was my, I think, driving focus at the time, was just to change the instrument, but not necessarily the music. And that was the question. Maybe I've dropped the question.
No, that was fine. It actually lends itself well to a transition to the next point, instrument design. It seems that you're typically following a rather slow and thorough approach to instrument design. That is, you didn't just release dozens of instruments But those few you have released became kind of genre-defining, larger-than-life instruments, particularly the LM1, the LinnDrum, the Linn 9000, the MPCs, most notably the MPC 60 and 3000, because the other ones you haven't been involved in. And particularly the latter ones had a true impact on how similar devices are still being designed worldwide. I mean, talking about the pad grid, the 4x4 pad arrangement. Was it hard to step out of that shadow by designing something completely different, like the LinnStrument or the Adrenalin amp modeling, sequenced filter, and basic drum machine box for guitarists, which I guess that should also be mentioned, was also responsible for Dave Smith's return to hardware?
Well, maybe not responsible, but an influence certainly. David looked what I had done with the Adrenaline, and he decided he should start another small company.
Right.
And then now his company is doing extraordinarily well. So, well, it's an interesting point. Yeah, what I've tried to do in my early days, I had a big company. It was at its peak 55 employees, and then I made the LM1 in 1980, the LinnDrum that followed it, which is about 10 times more successful in 1982, 1986, or 1985, or 1984 actually, was another product called the Linn 9000 that sold more than the original LM1, and it was actually quite popular, even though it had its problems with reliability. And then in 1988, there was the MPC 60. So actually, every 2 years there was a product. So that was fairly quick succession. And then in 1990, 91 was the MPC 3000, which was the next one after that in the MPC line. But after that point, I think I just had burned myself out in working and running a big company that I had, or for me, a big company, 55 employees. And then after Akai, I just decided I think I was going to retreat a little while and return to sanity because I had just worked so hard. So things in the 90s went slower. And also during that time is when the MPC was so popular and hip hop was happening. But I think the thread there is that I learned that I don't like running a company. I just like making cool products. And so in the late 90s, when I started my company, my current company, Roger Linn Design, I decided to keep it small. And so right now I actually have 0 employees, and I have a lot of outside consulting services. Like I use a contract manufacturer to not only manufacture my products, but to ship them for me so I don't have to keep any inventory. I work out of my home office, which is where I am right now. And so everything's very scalable because this business is not one where you make lots of money and has lots of ups and downs. And I've learned that over time. So what I do is I keep my expenses very low, and that allows me to operate a company more in the way that a musician might manage his albums or his creative releases. And then regarding a lack of making the same products or continuity of products, that flexibility of low overhead also allows me to do what I want to do. And so imagine you're a musician and you had one song in the 80s, you had another, and every 2 years you had a song in there. And maybe a lot of people here, it's 30 years later, 40 years later, people are saying, can you play your old hits? And you're touring around the world and you're playing your hits, but you are just god-awful bored with playing your old hits. And you'd like to be appreciated for what you're doing now, what you find fascinating now. And so it's a trade-off. I could just do what people want me to do, or I can do what I'm really excited about, because I've always been a person who's excited about new ideas. And so, for example, after the drum machines, I remember thinking to myself, I can design drum machines in my sleep. So it's not so interesting for me. But then came the Adrenaline, and that was born out of an idea of processing acoustic instruments through large modular synthesizers in sync to tracks. And then the LinnStrument was born out of the idea of trying to bring the expressiveness of beautiful acoustic instruments, solo instruments like guitar or violin or saxophone, to electronic music, which had lost that expressiveness because everyone's playing with on-off switches of MIDI keyboards. So they were all ideas that excited me at the time, much more than just doing what people wanted me to do. Now, that said, Dave Smith, the aforementioned Dave Smith, and I made a drum machine about 5 years ago. It's been very popular, and I'm working on a drum machine now. But I didn't want to do it until I had something interesting to contribute that was new and different. And so what I'm doing now is taking some of the ideas of my LinnStrument product, the three-dimensional expressive control, and applying it to making beats. So it's something new. It's a new idea. And for me, without ideas, the day is just boring.
But it's funny that you mentioned the obvious parallel to the musician who used to have a huge album. And because that would have been my next question. Because it is a bit like you have already recorded your, I don't know, Harvest Moon and Dark Side of the Moon and things like that.
Yeah.
And then what?
Exactly, yeah.
What one can recognize there is you seem to enjoy the process. You seem to have a soft spot for fancy renderings, for example. On your website, there's not only a portion where that you call the Design Museum, which contains all the already mentioned classics, but there's also a shelf design or shelf products side where one can find actually quite detailed finished renderings of a modular control surface for digital audio production, I assume, and a modular guitar system in pedal board and amp format. Several early LinnStrument designs, as well as several drum machine designs that also include early Tempest designs from before the time it was actually called the Tempest, but the Boom Chick, which rather looked a little bit more like a Dave Smith Evolver.
Yeah.
And there was the LinnDrum 2, for which there were two versions, an analog one and a digital one, also based on the collab with Dave. And then there was a LinnDrum 2 version that almost looked like an updated LM1, described as digital audio workstation featuring analog synthesis. With those many renderings, I mean, that actually looked like pretty finished products already, that made me wonder how you start the design process. I mean, what, for example, comes first for you, the internal technology or the user interface, and how do you prioritize features?
Very good question. I'm very much a top-down designer, or what you might call an outside-in designer. I start with the man-machine interface. To me, any product, it starts, the ideal product would be you put a little jack in the back of your neck, and it connects to your brain, and the music comes right out. You have a little RS-232 port, and music comes right out. And anything less than that is an impediment in the man-machine interface. And so I try to work backwards from that. I say, what's the goal? What's the musical goal? And what's the best interface to sound that you can possibly make? And each one of those is going to be an impediment. But I hate manuals. I don't like to read manuals. I try to make things as intuitive as possible and as simple as possible. Of course, it always ends up getting complex by the time I make it. But for that reason, the way I design any product these days is I start in 3D. Or actually what I'll do is I'll often start in 2D with just a layout of buttons and displays and interface elements. But then I quickly move into the 3D model, and that allows me to visualize it and imagine playing it, which to me is very exciting to do. And I just love these 3D programs. The one I use is called Rhino 3D because it's cheap enough that I can afford it and not pay these heavy prices for these annual contract programs like SolidWorks or Autodesk. But it's also very, very capable and allows you to do just about anything. So I'll start out on the outside and make it look very pretty, and then imagine it, what's playing it. And then if I want to go ahead with it, then I just build all the insides in the 3D model and finish it and get all those details. And if I don't really think it's a viable product, then I'll shelve it. Shelved, it means products you put on the shelf and you don't make. And so that's what that page on my website is about. It's products that I thought would be very good, but ultimately I didn't think either that they were viable enough to sell. There wouldn't be enough sold, or maybe at the time, since I think some of those I was independent, I didn't find a proper partner to work with that felt they were viable. But I still like them, and I thought people wanted to see the pretty pictures, so I put them up on the side.
Well, it's very unique that someone shares those things. I mean, usually, I don't know, it would take someone approaching you and asking you, "Hey, actually, would you like to share some pictures of how you developed something?" But it's usually not that the manufacturer puts all that stuff out there.
Yeah.
But one question with regard to what you said about the impediment of man-machine interfaces, would it actually be such an ideal solution to just plug in something or to hook up something to your brain and have that initially translated to music or any creative outcome? Or isn't it also that we enjoy, I don't know, tactile interactions? I mean, the feel of strings, for example, or how strings respond.
Well, yeah, I think there's certain kind of romantic associations we have, particularly with the past in music. For example, when I was a kid, I wanted to hold a guitar, and I wanted to be standing in front of a Marshall amplifier, and it was the tradition in that. And songs, as much as they change, they're still about adolescent love in most cases. There's a wonderful, there was a great joke about Paul McCartney. He once had a song called "Silly Love Songs," and the question of the joke was, when did Paul McCartney write silly love songs? And the answer is from 1962 to 19, whatever it was, right? All of his career, he wrote silly love songs. But there's a tremendous tradition with that. But at the same time, there are also people that have a romantic attraction to new ideas. Sometimes people feel warm and fuzzy about something that's completely new. And in this technological world, increasingly, I think people have that association. I think it's a combination of both. Mm-hmm. I think if people find the results, it would be very good. If there actually was a way to jack into your brain to just think of music and it occurred, there's all kinds of problems with that. For example, if you're all of a sudden reminded that you have to pick up your laundry in the middle of an instrument solo, it's going to make a very poor recording. So it would require a very disciplined mind to avoid some of those thoughts, right?
Yes.
So there are problems with that as a man-machine interface.
There's many design steps you'd like to take on your way to a finished product, and which also characterize the development of the LinnStrument. I mean, for example, you once mentioned that you planned the LinnStrument with a keyboard layout in the beginning, and then abandoned that in favor of the isomorphic design, which also distinguishes it from other multidimensional MPE controllers like the Rowley C-board, for example, or the Harken Continuum. And in a way, one could say that you already returned to your original instrument, the guitar, with the Linn, but even more so and in a more elementary way with the LinnStrument, simply because of how it is designed. Can you maybe reconstruct how you got there?
Well, yeah. First of all, for your audience, LinnStrument. Here's a picture of it. The way it works is each one of these buttons you play it and it makes a tone. And hold on, let me. And so the idea of it, though, and let me change this to a traditional instrument sound, just so people understand it. This instrument, in brief overview, LinnStrument, if you play any of these notes that are on the surface of it, it responds to three dimensions of touch: pressure, left-right movement for pitch, or forward-backward movement for timbre. In this case, it's the bow position of a violin sound. And then the arrangement of the notes is what you're referring to. I could have made this sort of this is a silicon rubber surface. I could have arranged it like a piano keyboard, but you can't do things like this. Actually, I can do this better with my left hand because I'm a guitar player. Those little note slides, you had to arrange these little rubber squares like a piano keyboard. It would be very difficult to do that because if you're sliding from a white key to a black key, it's a diagonal movement. If you're sliding from a white key to a white key, it's a lateral movement. Or if you're making, for example, a minor third bend, it's sort of a funny zigzag movement. It just doesn't work. And so the best way, if you want to have those natural bends of pitch, which are the primary expressive gesture, the purpose of the instrument, is to have all the notes in a line. And that happens to be like a string, for example, like a guitar string. So it really, the idea of this was not to make the note interface the same as guitars or string instruments, but merely, if you want those expressive pitch gestures, you need to have evenly spaced tones, right? So each one of these is a row, and you can't see it so much there, but there are blue lights here. That's the C. So the unlit notes are the accidentals. So all the notes are represented there. So that's the reason behind this layout, and it has many advantages. It's isomorphic, which means that if you play a particular chord or scale, it will be the same fingering in each of the 12 keys, unlike the piano. It has many advantages. So that's the main reason behind it. And so I find this to be a much better interface arrangement of notes. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. It's the standard layout in the Ableton Push product. It's the standard layout, and you mentioned the Roley company that makes the keyboard-oriented keyboard instrument, the piano-oriented. Well, they also make a product called Blocks. Right. And that has the same layout, this fourth string layout. So it's actually becoming a new standard interface for the performance of electronic sound, and particularly of expressive electronic sound. So that's the rationale behind it.
So you didn't quite willfully return to the guitar, but the way, at least it is laid out on the fretboard of the first guitar strings, or the bottom for guitar strings, happened to be the ideal layout.
Yeah, it's well, it turns out that those people that a few centuries ago designed the lute and violin, they were pretty smart. They had a good idea. But and at the time, the technology, for example, take a violin or a cello, or early models of that, like the old Agamo or something, the physics of a string required that each string play a series of semitones. I mean, we had equal tempered scales. The chromatic scale was 12 even notes to the octave. And so the idea was you were supposed to play at specific places on that string. But the physics of a string required that the notes be evenly spaced. Whereas the piano was a different experiment. It was saying, let's have equal spacing of the strings, but let's put the keys in different places, because based on the music at the time, the early designers of the clavier were saying, we don't like those accidental notes, those black keys. Let's put them in the back and make them a little bit smaller. The important ones are those white keys. Let's put them up front and make them bigger. And to do that, we'll make them evenly spaced. But the problem with it is that you, for simple music, it's very good. But on a piano, if you want to play what's called a major triad, like a C major chord, it's one fingering in the key of C, it's a different fingering in C sharp, different in D, different in D sharp. So it's 12 times as hard to learn anything but simple music. And so, to me, it's kind of funny that keyboardists today aren't playing pianos anymore. They're playing electronic keyboards. And the only reason that they have to be in a long line like that is because a few centuries ago, there had to be a string behind each key. Well, they're carrying these things around to gigs, and there's no strings behind those keys. So we get into habits after centuries, and it's hard to break those habits. But this is a new technology that not only I, but not only me, but a few other companies are embracing as a new way to have better man-machine interface to music.
On an acoustic piano, it's a mechanical necessity to have this arrangement. With the sound generator being independent, it's of course the opposite. And in that regard, the LinnStrument also serves as a bridge between performance and a different kind of technology, or as a tool that makes current technology, speak more easily, and not just any technology, but the one that works in conjunction with MPE, that should be added. That also made me think, again, I mentioned him before, but how closely you feel related to Don Buchler's approach, which I would roughly summarize as the following. New technology requires different interfaces in order to communicate and facilitate new technology adequately for musicians, which, by the way, is also why I would never consider Kim Bjørn's book on user interface design, Push Tone Move, to be a trivial affair, because it's difficult actually to come up with appropriate ideas for new technologies. But how do you see yourself related to Buchler's approaches?
Well, Don was always trying to, in creating this, Bob Moog, by comparison, just used the standard piano keyboard, and he worked on the sound synthesis. And he said, I'm just going to focus on the sound synthesis. Don said, the keyboard is horrible. The piano keyboard is horrible. Let's fix that too. And so he made some very interesting attempts at better human interfaces for it. And so I used to have breakfast every Thursday morning with Don at a coffee house, and a number of other people, Tom Oberheim and Dave Wessel, who was the head of Cal Berkeley's computer music school. We used to talk about a lot of these things. And so it was very inspiring, actually, for me. And we would have visiting dignitaries like Lippold Hawken, who made the Continuum, and talk about things like that. So it is very, very nice. So I think we were all interested in a better man-machine interface, and that was an exciting topic of conversation. And so my take on it, since I came from more of a popular music background and more of a what they call new music background, is I had noticed something, and that is that ever since popular music was being made with electronics, MIDI keyboards, drum machines, and such, the entire concept of an instrumental solo had virtually disappeared from popular songs. Now, when I was a kid, there was a guitar solo in rock records. There was a jazz sax solo in jazz records. In country, there was a fiddle solo or a pedal steel solo. In other words, the listening public said, these instruments are so beautiful that we want you to give us a dedicated section for a skilled player to play these instruments. Ever since music has been electronically generated, whether it's electronic pop or hip hop or any other electronically generated forms, the solo has disappeared. And I noticed something else. There's a lot of dance music being made, like EDM, with electronics. That's in the same way that electronics was no longer being used for the foreground in popular songs, but only for the background because there's no more instrumental solo. In EDM, electronics were being used for the background for dance. And then the other third category is film and TV music, music for picture. There's some beautiful music being written, but it's not the sort of music that people sit down and listen to by itself. They listen to it as a background for film and picture. So the problem I noticed that all this new electronic music was being used for background music as opposed to foreground music. And there were no instrumental stars. There are DJ stars. There are people that do things like live PA, and they can manipulate electronics. But no one actually pays to buy a ticket to sit down at a concert for someone doing this electronic music. There are some, but there's very few in comparison to earlier musical forms. It's usually people go to an event where there's background for dance, or the music is the background for the singer in popular songs, for example. And so I attributed this problem, as I see it, to the fact that everyone is playing music with on-off switches, which is what a MIDI keyboard is. You turn the sound off, turn the sound on, and then you turn the sound off. Now, a MIDI keyboard has a few attempts to add some vocal-like expression to it. There are two little sideways knobs on the left side, a pitch bend wheel. All it is a knob turned sideways, and that gives you a very poor human interface for bending the pitch as a guitar player bends a note or a violinist slides from one note to another. And then there's a modulation wheel that gives you, it's another sideways turned knob, and it gives you a mathematically perfect vibrato that's pretty much useless. Both of these knobs don't come anywhere to giving you the solo expression of a violin, guitar, saxophone, for example. And then you can, on a MIDI keyboard, a piano-style keyboard, electronic keyboard, you can sense a little bit of pressure for the last 5% of the travel of a key, which is pretty much useless because by the time the pressure kicks in, the note is already sounding. So you can't do the equivalent of wind on a wind instrument or the bowing pressure on a bowed string instrument. So I wanted with LinnStrument to make something that overcame these problems and gave people the expression that was possible with fine acoustic instruments, but not necessarily to play the music of the past. Instead, to apply these same principles to new electronic music and to make better electronic music. And so that's really the purpose of LinnStrument, and that's the purpose of the Rolly Seaboard, of the Continuum, of the sound plane from Madrona Labs, the Eigenharp from Eigen Labs and anyone, and others that are coming, is this new bubbling under revolution of adding expression back into musical instruments, right. and not just using the cheap trick. Because when you think about it, all we manufacturers have been doing for the past 40, 50 years is taking existing cheap technology and saying, now it's a musical instrument. And what is that technology? We all took the easy road out. We looked at what secretaries were using to enter data in computers, and we said, those can be musical instruments. And what are those things? Switches, knobs, and sliders. So we're taking the elements of data entry and using them to play music, which is really stupid. So in my view, if you look 50 years into the future, I think what they're going to call this era of electronic music now is the era of on-off switches. Before it was the era of expressive acoustic instruments. After it, maybe starting around 2025, is the era of expressive electronic instruments. And the 50 years intervening is the era of on-off switches, when expression was gone from music. So,
sorry for all the on-off switches here.
Yeah, you're surrounded by on-off switches. And so I think this is going to change. And I'm not saying that the music that's made now is bad. I think it's actually excellent. There's some wonderful ideas in background music. And I'm not saying the musicians are bad. I'm just saying that they're doing the best they can with extremely poor tools. On-off switches, knobs, and sliders. And that what's coming in the new revolution is this new opportunity to vary the note beautifully between the on and the off. And it's a very long answer to a very short question, but that's the basis of what I'm working on now.
But in that way, I guess one could also say your approach to the LinnStrument is rather old school, as it puts the player back at the center.
Yeah.
Instead of only automation and I don't know, all the automation techniques that have become so ubiquitous over the last couple of years. I mean, you hardly find a synthesizer without a sequencer anymore these days, for example. And instead you aim for putting back the gestures at the center of the performance, and by that also the personality of the musician, of how he or she is actually shaping the tone or timbre in real time.
That is certainly true. I would put it in a different way. If you listen to popular music today, where it's electronically generated, the foreground voice is the human voice. And these singers are wonderfully expressive. They have beautiful variations in loudness and pitch and timbre and subtle expression over the course of each note. So they're the foreground. So this is not old school. This is new school. It's just that the reason there's no more instrumental solos is the instrumentalists and their musical instruments haven't kept up. But the singers are just wonderful.
Yeah, but also I just mean the approach to actually learning to express yourself on an instrument, and instead of just a device, I would differentiate between a device and an instrument, something that actually feels and acts like an instrument, and I guess what you would call things with on-off switches is just a device.
The way I would put it is, one way is to say, I don't like it as much. I don't like a solo performed on on-off switches. But what I say doesn't really matter. What's more important is the listening public have collectively voted that music played with on-off switches is not worth their time. As a solo, as a foreground instrument, they say it's good enough for background music. I don't want to hear a solo anymore. I want to hear it as a background. It makes a good beat for me to dance to. It makes a good background for a singer. But without consciously thinking about it, the listening public has collectively voted to say, we want these instruments with on-off switches to be used for a background, but they're not interesting enough to be a foreground. So just keep them in the background.
Yeah.
So, it's not really my opinion.
There's a second interesting aspect, though. I don't know, I always think it was John Chowning having said that he conceives every synthesizer, by which he first and foremost meant the sound generator, not as one instrument, but as several instruments.
I didn't hear that.
That is, each sound you program, maybe it was someone else, but I remember it reading in the context of FM programming. I always thought that is a good thought, because every instrument, every sound you design is basically a new instrument. And if you have, synths like today, where you have a vast modulation matrix, and even if you use on-off switches and all that jazz, but you can assign several controllers to influence the sound in real time. And you can do that for each and every sound you program. So you're basically, at least virtually, every sound designer who makes full use of all the control, of all the MIDI controls, is basically designing a new instrument, having in mind how several controllers should behave and influence the sound. Now, that is something you basically put at the fingertip with the LinnStrument. At least through the three-dimensional movement. So you kind of minimize and maximize the sound shaping tools at the same time, but also, since sound shaping tools can also be instrument shaping tools, you basically can reconfigure instruments in real time by engaging in three-dimensional movements.
First of all, about John, who happens to live just a few miles away from me, he recognized early on that sound design was becoming or would become an integral part of composition. And John is first and foremost a composer. His piece, Stria, where his wife Marie sings, it's just beautiful in the way that it creates a new musical idea by the sounds as being an integral part of the composition itself. And so I think that's part of music today. You want to create a new sound. I mean, there's certain familiar ones. There are even old school synthesis sounds at this point, because synthesis has been around for a while.
Yeah.
But people are creating new sounds all the time. Now, what I'm doing is a little bit different in that I'm saying, regardless of what the sound is, the issue is there are just too many. It is too difficult to program in the type of expression that you hear in the human voice, or that you hear a Miles Davis play, or you hear a great saxophonist play, or a guitarist play. It's just too difficult. You can't do it because you're trying to program at least 3 continuous parameters in every note. It would take you forever. Although many people are trying, particularly from Germany. There are some people that love to program every little detail in there. And I assert that there's just too much, and ultimately it's faster to just practice and learn how to play it in real time. But it's the other thing too is that how much fun is it really to sit in a room alone and program every detail of every note for hours on end by sitting in front of a TV screen and rolling a little mouse around, or a trackpad. There's a certain fun to developing the skill to be able to play live, practice, and then be able to interact with other people. And I don't think that just because the newest technology happens to be electronics, that it's necessary to throw out everything that made music beautiful in past, but rather to apply it to new types of music. So I would like to see a whole new generation of young musicians that take these expressive instruments, as they're called, and they learn to be able to play in real time beautifully, in the same way that a singer learns to play in real time beautifully with his or her voice, as these singers in popular songs are. So it's a trick. It's more work, but actually, in the end, it becomes less work if you've got the time to put into it and you have the skill.
Yeah.
But the good news is that it's easier on these new instruments than it is to play a violin or a guitar or a saxophone. Those are very poor human interfaces. And these new instruments are actually much better human interfaces. So I see it as this ideal opportunity, given that there are virtually no instrumental expressive musical stars, solo performers these days. They're all the true solo artists are playing acoustic instruments or electrified acoustic instruments, but there are virtually no expressive solo performer stars right now. So it is the time of the highest demand and lowest supply of great new solo musicians, and there's never been a better opportunity in the history of music to be one of these new stars. But most people just don't see it because they're listening to background music. They don't really understand this giant gaping hole in the market that exists by the lack of solo performers.
You are also collaborating with people.
Yeah.
There was your wife, obviously, who's an electrical engineer from Munich and specialized in audio communications and acoustics, and to my understanding also a very avid MSP programmer.
Yeah.
And she co-developed some algorithms for the Adrenaline 3 and also the Sync plugin, and helped you out on the business side, and I guess was appointed general manager. I mean, she is currently not anymore, I think, but she basically was co-owning Roger Linn Design, right?
Yeah.
So that's one highly significant person. Then the already mentioned Dave Smith, which I guess helped you out on some coding.
Yeah.
Yes, he helped you out on the first Adrenaline, and then got attached to the idea of returning to hardware himself.
Yeah.
And then there are software engineers like the famous Gerd Bevin, and who's also collaborating or consulting Moog on a lot of projects, and Tim Thompson. Can you tell a little bit about those people and how you approach your collaboration?
Well, they're all friends who I have great respect for. I mean, of course, my wife, who I'm married to, but
it's good if she's your friend
Ingrid,
too.
Well, she is my friend too. Yeah, that's true. Ingrid actually, she got her engineering degree from Technical University in Munich, and she helped out with the company early on. But actually, her passion was more to be a small piece of a larger company. So she worked for the Dolby company for a while. And now she's actually manages a group of people in the audio hardware department at Apple. She manages the people that are called engineering project managers, and so which is what the field she's done. She doesn't do coding or engineering work, but she knows it, and so she's able to be more of a management role, which is very nice. And she likes that better, being a small piece of a very large pie, and being part of a company like Apple, right? But as far as the other people you mentioned, Gerd Bevin, who is just absolutely brilliant, and is the most brilliant programmer I've ever worked with, and music particularly, music programmer in particular, or Tim Thompson, another guy who lives here locally. Gerd lives in Belgium. Tim lives here in Northern California, near where I live. But the idea of it is these are people that I couldn't hire if I wanted to. I couldn't afford it. But instead, when I recognized talent, I just asked them, would you be interested in helping me? And for example, Gerd, he said, yes, I'd like to help you with your software, your LinnStrument. I had gotten it to a point where it played in basic form, but it needed a lot more done. And I just don't have the time or the skill as a programmer to take it much farther than that. Gerd stepped in, and it was immediately obvious how skilled this guy is. And so what I said to him, I said, look, I tell you what, I would like to just let you be in charge of the software of the instrument, and I'll pay you a royalty on every one, because software is so complex that you either have to have a huge team of people that you can replace at any time if they leave, or you have to have one genius who's in charge of it, and let him have a piece of the action. And Gerd is so valuable to me that I said, please just take this over and share the love. So when things are successful, you get more money. And when things are not so successful, we're both going to suffer. And Tim, he's actually independently wealthy. He made a lot of money in tech years ago. So he was just doing another fun project. And he loves fun projects. Every year he goes to the Burning Man Festival out in the desert where he has a thing that he calls the Photon Salon. And he shows this instrument he created called the Space Palette, where you sort of wave your hands in the air and move them through picture frames, and you create sound and visual, and people just love it. And he has a new one that uses 4 of these pressure-sensitive trackpads from the Sensel company to do the same thing. And he just loves to make these instruments. So it was a fun thing for him to do, and I feel very privileged that Tim helped me out on that in the early stages of LinnStrument, and the Gerd is involved in it now. And I don't have to, because it's part of my philosophy of running a company, sort of like a musician, making an album now and again, but not. As I mentioned earlier, I think, or to add to what I mentioned earlier, I discovered that I really don't like running a business, but I love brainstorming with bright people. And so this works out very nicely. I get a piece of people's time as much as they're willing to do, and I get to be creative collectively with people that I have great respect for. And so it's very nice to do that. And I have another friend named Darius Mostaki who does the circuit board layouts for me. And in this new drum machine I'm working on, which is the one I've been working on for a while, I call LinnDrum 2. I don't know if that's what it'll end up being called, but he's now helping me with the circuit design of that. And so it's very nice. And I can call these people in to work on them, enjoy it. It's a collaboration among equals. I don't have to tell someone, get this done by the end of the day. They just, it makes it fun. And it's kind of like if I was writing a song,
Right.
I'd bring in someone and say, can you help me with this song? Something like that. It's more about people who think of themselves more as creators creating together and the fun and the joy of all that.
Yeah, I mean, it happened very often that instrument designers were not really fans of the business.
Yes.
I mean, certainly not the likes of Bob Moog.
Or Don Buckley either. He had so many bad deals.
That's an obvious one, yes.
Yeah. And, I felt so sorry with Don because his death was accelerated by this business deal he had with these unscrupulous, evil Australian investors who they made a just horrible contract penalizing him financially if he dies, if he gets sick. It's just some of the most unheard of cruel things. And so and I think that's why I like being independent. And I've had offers from investors, but I said, no, I'm going to keep it independent. My mission statement is I want to make fun things that make better music.
Yeah.
And that's all I have to do.
Talking about the collaborations and the network you're obviously part of, how big or how vast is the actual MPE supporter network right now? I mean, as far as manufacturers and developers go, because I also know that people like Amos Gaines from Moog are behind it, and
well, MPE, just to give a brief description, is something that is used, if you want to, on LinnStrument or in the Rollies keyboard or any of these other, expressive instruments, and it solves a fundamental problem with the MIDI standard. MIDI is that round cable that goes from a keyboard to a sound synthesizer. And the idea of MIDI, it was designed around a piano keyboard. And I mentioned earlier that, and many of your audience would probably know this, a MIDI keyboard has a pitch bend wheel on the side. So in the creation of the MIDI standard, they created a message called pitch bend. And that means that all your notes go over on the MIDI cable and one wheel to change the pitch. So whenever you change the pitch, it must apply to all the notes you're playing. So you can't just change one note, and you can't have two different notes changing in pitch. So all MPE is it uses this concept of MIDI channels, which already existed since 1984, the creation of MIDI. And instead of sending all the notes over one MIDI channel, of which there are 16, it allows each note to be sent over its own channel with its own individual pitch bend message and other things too. But the primary thing it allows you to do is to have independent pitch bend notes. So, for example, if I'm playing a sound here, like let's take this pedal steel guitar sound. So. So if I hold one note, a popular pedal steel gesture, one note stays in place and the other note moves. Or if I do a harmony line, it works. Now that couldn't work on a MIDI keyboard for many different reasons. But so it was necessary to create this new way of using MIDI. So I recognized this. The Rolly company that makes the keyboard recognized it. Moog recognized it. You mentioned Amos. And Apple recognized it. And Hawken recognized it. So we all started a conversation together and said, why don't we all just standardize on this method of being able to have polyphonic pitch slides? And so we all agreed the best thing to do is just this way of sending a note on each channel. And we called it multidimensional polyphonic expression. And now the MIDI organization has changed the name, kept the letters, but changed the name to MIDI polyphonic expression. And so at this point, it's become this new standard, and there are at least 80 different software and hardware synthesizers for Windows, Mac, iOS, and hardware that use this standard now. And so it's it allows someone who buys an instrument or a keyboard or a Continuum to use one of these popular synthesizers and be able to have this feature. But that said, one of the main purposes of these expressive instruments is to create expressive solo parts. Well, solo parts, by their very nature, are not polyphonic. So you can still play expressively over one of these MIDI channels because you're only playing one note at a time anyway. So it's not necessary, but it's an ideal solution to be able to have one system where you can do both solos and chord parts where you can move your fingers anywhere you want at any time for any reason.
A simple question about your daily business. How does a typical day in the life of Roger Linn look like?
Well, let's see. I wake up usually around 6 a.m. And then my wife has to get up because she has to get into Apple. She has to deal with the normal constraints of working a job. And I'll make her breakfast. And then at around, she leaves at around 8 o'clock to go because she's only about 7 minutes from Apple from where we live. And then I sort of slowly get up and I'll read the New York Times and such. And around 9 o'clock, I start working, and I work at various parts of the house. I could be in the office here. I could be in the living room. I could be in the garden. And I just take my laptop and work on what I'm doing. Some orders will come in, and I'll process those, and I will send them over to my manufacturer to ship them. And once I finish the orders, I'll do my own support. I have some emails that come in from customers, and they'll ask questions about LinnStrument or about Adrenaline or about any of my products. I have about 18,000 customers, but because I've created a very effective website, I actually don't get that many personal support emails. But I do answer all the support emails myself because there's no one else to do it. And so anyway, that's about the first a couple of hours, maybe 3 hours, and there'll be some other administrative stuff I have to deal with during that time. Then after that time, I go on to engineering, which at this point now is engineering for this new drum machine I'm working on, the one I mentioned that brings the expressive control of LinnStrument to drums.
Is there anything you can tell about this LinnDrum 2?
LinnDrum 2 is the working title, at least for that anyway. Once again, I'm not sure what it'll eventually be called. What I can do is demonstrate one of the principles of expressive control. I have on my LinnStrument here, I just set it settings to work for doing drum beats. And let's say, I'm not sure how well you can see that, but each one of the 128 pads on this smaller LinnStrument now has a different drum sound, but I've set LinnStrument's auto repeat feature called the arpeggiator. And first of all, I'm going to show you, here's a feature that I invented back in 1984 called note repeat, where you vary the pressure on the pad and it creates repeated notes. Now, that's a concept that's been around since 1984, and it's been popularized more in recent years with, for example, a product called Ableton Push, one dimension of variable control. And I introduced this on my product called the Linn 9000 in 1984. So what I've added in this case is this three-dimensional control that you saw earlier in playing the violin or the other instruments. So I can do that same hi-hat, but I can also move my finger left and right to change the pitch. And if I tilt my finger forward, I can change natural sounding hi-hat into a pressure-controlled filter. So I can move my finger all around and get a variety of tones, which is more expressive, as I would consider it. And that's independent for all drums. Here's the snare drum. And so I can take 3 fingers and make a little beat out of that. Just by varying the pressure, respectively, between the 3 drums. And then with my thumb, I can change the repeat rate. And I can combine that with the pitch bend in the beat. And while I'm doing that beat, I have one hand free, and I can use that in the split keyboard on the instrument to play a bass part. So this is the application of this expressive control to making beats, which I think will be a new revolution in beat making. And it'll make everyone see that they've been playing on-off switches until that time.
I assume it's based on a digital engine.
Yes, it's unlike the LinnStrument, which only just creates the MIDI notes, and you need an external computer or iPad or synthesizer to make the sounds. The drum machine will have its built-in sounds, its built-in sequencers. You can completely independently make beats and then just take the audio outputs from it.
Do you have a rough estimate, when you are planning to announce it?
Yes, when it's finished.
That's a good answer.
There's still a lot of work to do. That's the answer, by the way, also given by the makers of the 3D software I use, Rhinoceros. Whenever they announce a product, and there's always a FAQ, it says, when will it be done? And the head of the company says, it will be done when it's finished. But it'll be a while. There's still plenty of work to do on it and refinements. But I must say it's very exciting, and I think it'll really have a big impact on, I think, the way people make beat-oriented music.
We use this as a cliffhanger. As of late, the music industry is or has been going through some major shifts. I mean, more and more boutique manufacturers are empowered through online business options. I mean, you yourself are even one of those, basically. And there's more direct interaction between customers and manufacturers. Old distribution models are fading away, and some manufacturers are starting to skip once mandatory events like the NAMM show, and partially due to the exorbitant fees being involved. And at the same time, other and more specialized events take place, like the Super Booth in Europe, and the Moog Fest and NobCon in the US. And in January, you posted the following statement on your website. Going to NAMM, we're not. Like Moog, Dave Smith Instruments, and Tom Oberheim, I, Roger, have decided to skip it this year. It seems odd to me to have a music product dealer convention in the internet era, given there are so few remaining independent music product dealers. Now, apart from the fact that you obviously didn't have a new product to show around the time of Winter NAMM anyway, your absence and that of the others was noted on a wider scale, not least because you're considered to be part of a group of renowned US-American manufacturers whose presence is simply taken for granted at such an event. But how do you see the future when it comes to the interaction between manufacturers and, well, let's say the rest of the world? And what do you perceive as challenges and opportunities, especially with regard to what you said about why not going to NAMM?
Well, the challenge, of course, is finding a way for people in all corners of the world to be able to try out an instrument and put their hands on it and play it. But the thing is, regardless of whether I go to a trade show or not, there's no place to do that anyway. So I work my way around that. What I have on my website, it says, if there's not a dealer in your area, which is likely, please send me an email, because it's very likely, in the case of LinnStrument, with over 1,600 of them sold now, that there's already someone in your area that has a LinnStrument. And the community of LinnStrumentalists is actually a very vibrant community of people that are interested in meeting other people with with whom they can share their love of ideas about new musical instruments. And so often, someone will write me and say, for example, I'm in Munich. Is there someone there? And there might be 6 or 7 instrument owners in Munich. So I'll write one of them and say, would you mind doing me the great favor of letting this person in Munich who wants to see your instrument, let him see it and try it out. And usually the people are very kind. They say yes. Maybe if you ask someone nicely about something, they're very kind. And the other thing I try to do,
Well, they can take him out for a beer or
yeah,
something.
exactly, yeah. And the other thing I try to do is be accessible. Anyone can write to me. The phone number is on the site. It says, I'd appreciate it if you'd look in your online manual first and look at the FAQs, because I'm busy doing a lot of stuff, but you're welcome to contact me. And so a combination of that, a combination of personally doing events like this, where people can see, they get an idea of who I am, what I'm doing, that I'm honest, that I'm trying to do something good for music. And I think that makes them feel better about visiting my site and saying, well, what is this guy doing? Let me learn a little bit more about it. And because we're in the era where you can be, in the common vernacular, canceled in a minute. If you're, for example, a musical artist, there are people who have just been canceled for something they say on Twitter. And so, it's all out there, and you can't take it back. And so the only option is just to be a good person and be honest. And the truth is, it's pretty easy to do that, given how badly people are abused by companies these days. It's easy to give great service because all you have to do is do the right thing. And it's not expensive to do the right thing. You have to be humble. You have to admit mistakes. You have to tell the truth if there's a fault in a product. And usually people are accepting of that. They look at the whole package. So I think the answer is, in this era of the internet, is try to give people as much honest information as possible. Give them a way to buy it and send it back if they don't like it. Give them a way to, other than dealers, if there aren't dealers now, to give them a way to try it out locally, and do a lot of videos. For example, one day someone wrote to me and said, how sensitive is LinnStrument to light touches? And because it's published on there that it takes 70 grams to press one of the pads, but they don't know what that feels like. So I made a video with the camera really close up and playing it with even my little finger and showing that you could play it. And that it was the best demonstration I could do to show that it's actually taking a very light touch to play.
But I actually like the idea of hooking up people with users, with actual users. Well, that leads a bit to a connected question, because what is your take on the more community-driven approach as it manifests itself behind events like NobCon or Superbooth?
I was actually thinking about doing more of these. And since I'm not doing NAMM anymore, I'll have more money to do so. NAMM cost me about $12,000 to do. And essentially what I'm doing
for 3 days or something.
Exactly. It's ridiculous. Yeah, it's not. They're supposed to be in this industry organization, but they're purely a profit organization. And so what I ended up doing was doing 3 days of demos for LA musicians personally, which is good. But it's $12,000 is a lot to pay to do demos for LA musicians, particularly when it's so hard to set it up. And that's just me doing it myself, and with a friend helping me out to play, to demonstrate. But I was thinking about doing some more of these regional shows, because NAMM is a sales show. It's not really an ideas show, but these small shows, they're ideas show. They're enthusiast shows where people get together because they love something. And they want to find out about new ideas. And to me, that's just more fun. Superbooth is great. And you mentioned the other one, NobCon and the other ones that are happening in the United States.
NobCon and Mogfest. Yeah.
Mogfest, yeah. And that's where I introduced the LinnStrument, actually. And it was just marvelous to see the excitement that people had about this. Because these are all people that have been thinking the same things I have. And they were so hungry for a new idea. And whereas NAMM is usually just salesmen and representatives from stores coming by to not place an order, and it's so funny because there aren't any more dealers anymore, because in Europe, Thomann has put most of the dealers out of business. In the United States, Musician's Friend has put most of the dealers out of business. Not that they're bad, that's just the way of the world. And so, it's so silly to pay so much to go to what's supposed to be a dealer show that doesn't let the public in, even though they get it anyway. But to have a dealer show in an era where there's no dealers, it makes no sense. So I prefer to deal directly to the people that are excited about the products and try to raise their interest, show them what's good about the things I'm making, meet interesting people in a little booth, and stand there and do my dog and pony show for a day.
Well, next Super Booth has just been announced. It's going to take place in May again.
Well, I haven't done Super Booth in the past few years. I did it 4 years ago. And the only problem I found with it is the Super Booth is focusing on the people that use the Eurorack synthesizers, the modular synthesizer standard that's come to
it's huge now. I mean, you find all kinds of people there. I mean, there's even Yamaha and Roland are there. There's all the Eurorack people, but also all the people that create alternative everything, be it controllers, be it sequencers, be it whatever.
Well, the problem I found with Super Booth was that with LinnStrument, I'm making this controller, this keyboard for the playing of expressive musical notes. But I noticed there that a lot of the people who are fans of Eurorack modules, many of them are making what I would call sound effects music, where they touch a little brass plate and then all of a sudden you hear a sound kind of like, and they say, wasn't that beautiful? I said, it's really interesting. But I would call it more sound effects music.
You know what interesting means in academia.
Well, yeah. But I would say, and in academia, it's the same sort of thing. If you go to often to Stanford or Berkeley Cal, and you go to some of the electronic music concerts, it's what some people call blink and bloop music. There's no notes, there's no melody, harmony, rhythm. It's just, sometimes 45 minutes of, and some of it's good. They say you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. But a lot of the time it's just broken eggs to my ears. And I happen to have a personal preference for things like musical notes and chords and melodies and harmony and rhythm. And so I think those things are ephemeral. I think they can apply as much to electronic music as they can to acoustic music. And so at Super Booth, I found that a lot of the people would come over to my little booth to play LinnStrument, and they didn't really know what notes were, but they were interested in this. They were passionate about the creation of sounds. And so it seemed it wasn't worth it for me to go all the way over to Berlin to show a musical instrument to people who were interested more in sound type music.
I see. Well, maybe it needs to be communicated that it can still be an attractive device for Eurorack users. I mean, I've seen YouTube videos of Eurorack users using the LinnStrument.
Well, it's all legitimate. It's just there are different, but I may go back to Super Booth in years hence, because I know there is an element of people there who enjoy playing notes, and for which LinnStrument has value. I mean, for the rest of them, it's not so much of value, I think, because you can take a little chord chaos pad and you can move your finger around and you can vary sounds. But I think there are probably enough people there that want to play notes that it would be valuable. The other thing, too, is it's always so cool to go to Berlin. Yeah, I think I'll probably go back, and I would like to do some more of these regional shows because they're cheap and they're around people that are focused more on ideas than selling. And like I say, Berlin is such a cool city because it's such a wonderful concentration of creative, passionate, artistic people that it's just fun to be there,
With all the new technology on the rise, and there's not only Eurorack, which is only partially new. I mean, it's a great space for innovation, I guess, but the format in itself is not new. But with Eurorack and its burgeoning scene, there are also more and more gestural controllers, of which your LinnStrument is one. And the other big topic is machine learning and artificial intelligence, AI, which may affect the whole way of how we not only make music, but compose or distribute music. And it might even question the role of the artist as a as a whole. How does your aim to bring back the humane to current man-machine interfaces relate to that latter point? I mean, what are your thoughts about AI and machine learning research and how it might affect music making, performing, and being an artist?
Well, it's there's a lot of interesting stuff. Actually, it's funny you say this because I just attended a lecture last night by a friend of mine who's also a LinnStrument owner on using quantum computing for composition. And so he created a program which he's using on the remote servers of the Rigetti quantum computer, which is one of the companies making quantum computers, to compose music. And it uses this large-scale optimization features of quantum computing to optimize the composition in real time, generated composition. Now, of course, what he had in results was elementary, but the idea was very interesting. And there were about 100 people there. It was some of the smartest people in the world. And, there's three lectures. One company it was Airbus, and they were talking about using quantum computing to simulate the flight of jets in the air, of airplanes. Another one was talking about protein folding, which is a fascinating topic, using quantum computing to optimize the creation of drugs that fold proteins in different ways. And the third one was my friend talking about how to compose music, and that's the one that actually probably was the least useful but the most interesting. This is a form of AI, and I think it has a lot of potential. I think it really depends on what your goal is. I mean, for example, LinnStrument uses a form of AI. It's basically saying, let's let the software do the things you don't want to do and let you focus on the things you want to do. So, for example, it corrects your pitch without affecting your expressive control, right? Violin is very difficult. Those damn notes are just so close together that it's hard to play in tune. It'll take you 5 years just to get intonation on a violin. But on LinnStrument, for example, or a Seaboard or others, it quantizes your initial pitch and it quantizes your movements of pitch, but without affecting your vibrato or pitch slides and things like that. So you can still do those expressive gestures. I think it really depends on what your goal is. And because one of the goals of musicians is the joy of playing music. In other words, developing a skill, overcoming a challenge, and then being able to play music in real time. So there's certain things that you want to offload to the software, but there's certain things you don't. There's certain things that you want to be able to play and to celebrate the human achievement. And if you think about it, ultimately AI can probably write songs for us. It can probably perform instruments for us in fairly convincing ways based on the past, right? If it listens to music on the internet and it trains itself, it can probably come up with a convincing solo after a few years of working on this, or the lyrics for a song, and do all that. So, but what would that result be? That result would be that you'd press a button and you'd get a song. There are two things that drive our culture. One is pragmatism. We want something as easy as possible with as little work. We want the result. I want to hear a song. I'll press a button and a quantum computer will generate it for me, and I'll have a complete recording. That's great. But the other thing is that we value the human achievement. We also value tradition, and we value the exception to the rule. And so we do all kinds of stupid things in our lives. It would be much better if all our furniture were made from plastic. It would never scratch. It would be cheap. But we think we make things out of wood, or we have craftsmen make them because we want to sit on something that's a human achievement, right? And we go to a concert not to hear a quantum computer play music. We go to a concert. We pay money to buy a ticket to go to a concert by a Jimi Hendrix or Miles Davis because we want to be in the presence of someone whose life is less ordinary. Their life is extraordinary. It celebrates the human being. So it really depends on what your goals of AI are. Every time AI gets a little bit better or technology gets a little bit better, it changes how we think about what is uniquely human. For example, if you use GarageBand on the Mac, there's all these loops. Well, I used to love to create backing tracks. and then put some guitar solos over there or something like that, or write songs with them. Then I found out I could just drag that loop over. Well, it made me feel differently about what is uniquely human and creative about what I did. In a similar to way that before the IBM computer Deep Blue beat a chess champion, the world's chess champion in the 90s, people said, they said, when a computer can beat a chess champion, then computers will truly be intelligent. Well, after it beat a champion, what did they say? They didn't say computers are finally intelligent. They said, I guess chess wasn't that hard. You know, it was a different idea. We still value what the human contributes to our society. And so I think there will be wonderful experiments, and it may be that it comes to a time when you can press a button in a software program and it'll generate a song for you. And it'll be fairly convincing in the same way that a fairly a derivative artist can write a song like a song that's existed before. But that will just mean that the songs generated at the computer won't be valued by the society, because people will say, anybody can do that, so I guess that wasn't so hard. I want to hear a song that's written by a great human, a human that only comes along every 10 or 20 years or a century. That's what I value. I want to celebrate the human achievement. I want someone who's smarter than the computer. I want someone who says, I can predict the future of our culture. And that's basically what the artist is. He's the person who has craft, but he tells us where our culture is going. And that's why we value the artist. It's the person who gives us a pointer on the road ahead. And so I don't think AI, even if it can do a fairly convincing to most people rendition of that, a rendering of that sort of projection, it will never be as good as or valued as much as what the human brings to it. And so I think that's my view anyway.
How about the collective element? Because people like Bob Moog and I think, even Peter Gabriel, when talking about the advanced technology of their time, warned that it might all end up being a very isolating experience, and we end up all as bedroom producers getting served generic piecemeal for our own music production instead of going out and performing as it used to be in a group of people, be it in a band or in a classic ensemble. Did you think about how that relates to playing something like the LinnStrument? Could you imagine a LinnStrument ensemble? Or I mean, of course you could, but do you see any way an instrument like that can help fostering this approach?
Sure. I think that, the technologies that exist so far, the people who made them didn't quite consider the interaction of musicians. But you already start to see that as a consideration. For example, Ableton, who makes that wonderful live software and the push controller, they created a few years ago software called Link, so that people could play in sync with each other much easier than wiring MIDI cables. It uses a wireless method of having all the instruments together playing in sync. And I think that's a step towards that. And so it's just a matter of we technologists making better instruments. I think ultimately technology has always had a dramatic effect on art. And so we're playing the music that the instruments want us to play. A great example of technology on art. Once photography came around, portrait painters were largely out of a job because you could take a picture of somebody. It wasn't necessary anymore. And so that's when you started to get into impressionism and abstraction. But this is a fascinating subject because we are playing in popular music, in EDM, for example, we are playing the music that the computers want us to play. If you look at all aspects of society where computers have been introduced into that aspect, the computer is generally used to take a well-defined task and do it over and over and over and over again. How does that apply to music? Looping, beats, sequences. So it's easy for the computer to delegate to the computer, just play these things over and over again. So you have music that loops something forever. And I often feel when I listen to EDM, as creative as it often is, I feel like I'm endlessly in the intro. I'm waiting for the meat of the song to start. For the lyric, for melody, for any sort of a foreground element. But it's just, you can go for 18 minutes with a beat, and that's it. Well, that's great if you've got another foreground, like dance or a party or conversation. But no, I don't think it's really interesting to listen to by itself as a foreground, as I was saying earlier. So I think the technology has to improve, and that's part of what's happening with these expressive musical instruments, electronic instruments, is we're now providing a technology for people to make a foreground voice. And so once this starts to filter through the culture more pervasively, then people will start to make the music that this new technology wants you to make, in addition to the background music.
Yeah, which I guess you also called object-oriented composition.
Yeah, OOC, OOC. I'll take a beat from over here, and I'll take a sequence from over here, and a loop from over here, and put them together, and I'm an artist. I used at one lecture a great analogy. I said, as a songwriter, I always wanted to be a better poet. I was lousy at lyrics, but I valued the lyrics of a Bob Dylan or somebody like in one of the people I wrote for, Mary Chapin Carpenter, or many of the others, Paul Simon. I didn't have that talent. And then I thought, wait a minute, maybe I could be like a DJ. What I'll do is I'll take a line from this poem and a line from this one, a little bit from Blake, a little bit from Shelley, a little bit from Andrew Marvell, To His Coy Mistress, a few stanzas from this poem, and put them together in my own unique artistic combination, and I can call myself a poet, But that's essentially what a lot of DJs are doing. They're saying, I'll take loops, and I'm talking about the expensive DJs too. They're saying, I'll take some loops, most of which are submitted by other people to me or I found on the web, and I'll combine them in my novel way and call myself an artist. And to me, and they make compelling music. They make compelling background music at one tempo, never changing, and with beats playing in endless repetition. But it is compelling. It's just that I would prefer, if I'm doing that, to say I created all those elements, which, by the way, some DJs do. But there's quite a few of them that say I'm an artist because I'm combining in my novel way music created by other people.
What would be your advice for future designers?
Well, I think one thing is to think of a musical goal. Presumably, if someone wants to design a musical instrument, they're also a musician. They're passionate about music. I would say focus on the music you want to make or that you think people want to make with your instrument. What I see too often are people falling in love with the technology, and they'll say, I want to make a synthesizer with more envelope generators, more low-frequency oscillators, more oscillators, more samples, bigger, better, more. But what I would say is, think of why you want to do this. What was the first thing in your life that made you want to, that brought you to music? Well, I think for most people, they would say they fell in love at some point with music. They didn't fall in love with envelope generators. They didn't fall in love with knobs or switches. They didn't fall in love with MIDI cables. They fell in love with music. So focus on music and think of what's the solution you can do to make better music. And anything between you and the making of better music is a step towards your goal, but it is not in and of itself the goal. The goal is not to make a better envelope generator. It's to make better music. And so I say if you can do that, I think you have a better chance of something that truly has an impact on the culture.
Those are very good last words. Roger, I really want to thank you for taking your time. And it was a huge chunk of time as I watched the clock. It has been an immense pleasure talking to you. Oh,
thank you very much. And I love your questions, too. They're very relevant. They're very important questions. And it's nice. Usually I get questions about tips and tricks and about the early days of the drum machine, which are nice to talk about. But it's nice to talk a little bit more about ideas, too.